Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. This is Sabrina Paganoni, and I'm here with Catherine Small and Alison Bulat, our patient navigation team. And we can go to the next slide. Thank you for joining tonight. So today we want to do something different, and actually I'm going to do a little bit of a three-part series here for the next couple of weeks in terms of a summary of where we are in ALS. And the reason I thought I would be doing this is because of questions and comments I received from some of you who asked us to sort of summarize where we are. So rather than providing kind of step-by-step updates, we were also asked to provide summaries of where we are. And so I want to do that over the next 3 weeks, so today and two weeks after this, to really summarize where we are in ALS clinical trials. So first of all, I think that we all know that the therapy options for ALS are expanding. So today, I want to focus on what we have, and then next week I'll talk about where we are with what we found with the platform trial so far, and the following week I want to talk about where we're going next. So I think that most of you know that right now, in May 2023, we have 4 approved drugs in the US for the treatment of ALS. The first 3, riluzole, radicava, and Relyvrio, are approved for all forms of ALS. And the most recent one, tofersen, is approved for a very specific form of ALS, which is associated with the SOD1 gene. So the SOD1 gene affects about 2% of the entire ALS population. So obviously a minority, but nevertheless, we're very excited that we have this new compound that was just approved in April of 2023. So if you look at the dates of approval, I really want to convey the message that the progress in ALS is truly accelerating. So yes, it took a while to get to this point. You know, the first drug was approved in the 90s, but if you think about the last few years, you can see an acceleration in terms of the development of new drugs. So radicava was first approved in the US in 2017 in its intravenous form, and then in 2022 in oral form. Then Relyvrio, which is the combination of PB and terso, was approved in September 2022, and then most recently again, tofersen was approved in April 2023. So I think that we are seeing more approvals over the last few years, and actually I think we're going to see more. And the reason for that is that we have many more trials, as I will discuss later. So because therapy options are expanding, obviously early diagnosis and access to care are incredibly important. And in addition to these 4 drugs that I mentioned, there are also other medications and supportive care options that are important to treat symptoms. Next slide. So I just want to go by one, and I want to hit a few key points here. So riluzole was approved in the 90s based on 2 studies that enrolled about 1,000 people. The duration of each clinical trial was between 12 to 18 months. And really what the researchers were looking at the time was the difference in survival between people who received active or placebo. And again, the 2 trials combined enrolled about 1,000 people. And there were very long trials in the 90s, 12 to 18 months, again, looking for differences in survival. Now, the trial design has really changed since then. It took a while, but I'm glad that now we have shorter and more efficient trials. So if we can go to the next slide, you can see that fast forward to radicava or Darvon, that was approved based on the so-called study 19. The study lasted 6 months, and the primary outcome or the main goal of the trial was to see a difference in function. And we measure function using a scale called the ALS-FRSR scale, or total score on the scale, and ALS-FRSR stands for ALS Functional Rating Scale Revised. This scale was actually developed in the context of a previous trial after the riluzole trial, and the reason for developing a scale was to be able to detect a change without waiting to look for survival events. The idea was to enable shorter trials, for example, 6 to 12 months, where we could compare differences in function when you compare active against placebo. And so in the study 19 of radicava, there was a difference between the 2 groups at 6 months or week 24 there was about 2.5 points in favor of edaravone when you compare active to placebo. Now, the population that was included in this trial was much smaller. I told you before that the riluzole trial had about 1,000 participants. Study 19 had 137 participants. And the reason that we were able also to see a difference in such a smaller trial is because they also narrowed down the inclusion criteria so that they could enroll a relatively homogeneous population to be able to see a treatment effect, if there was one, in a relatively smaller trial. Next slide. Now, the other trial I want to talk about is the central trial. They also included 137 participants. The study duration of the placebo-controlled period was 6 months, and that the result of the trial led to the approval of Relivio, which is the combination of PB and TER, again, for all forms of ALS. And of note, as we do more trials, previous standard of care is allowed. So, for example, the Radicava trial allowed people to take riluzole. The Relivio trial allowed people to take riluzole and or Radicava. So we're continuing to add on top of the previous standard of care, and that's very important. This study also had a 6-month duration in terms of the placebo-controlled trial, and during that period, there was a 25% slowing in declining function in the functional rating scale, same scale that was used in the other trial. And the absolute difference was 2.32 points at week 24. And again, a homogeneous population was selected to be able to see a treatment effect in a relatively fast and with a relatively small trial, again, because really we want to move past the idea of incredibly large and incredibly long trials for the purposes of efficiency. The central trial included a feature that was actually quite important, because after the 6 months placebo-controlled portion of the trial, participants were allowed to enter an open label extension. And then we followed participants long-term, and we saw that there was a 4.8 months longer median survival in the participants who started the trial on Relivio or PB/TER, so compared to the participants who started on placebo. So again, you can see here the impact of the drug on both function and survival, and that's what led to the approval last year. Next slide. So I want to share now, like my thoughts about, combinations of drugs. So we know that multiple mechanisms are implicated in ALS, and this diagram shows the representation of the main cell types that are involved in ALS, including the motor neurons or the nerve cells. Now, there's many reasons why people may get ALS, and actually they could converge or combine different ways in different individuals. The problem is that we don't know, with the exception of genetic forms of the disease, we don't know which is the initial triggering event, and we don't know what sort of combination of the different mechanisms may happen in an individual patient. So when you look at the 3 drugs that were approved for ALS, if you can click one more time, you can see that the first drug, riluzole, the first drug that was approved targeting one specific mechanism, glutamate excitotoxicity. Now, the second drug that was approved, if you can click one more time, targets a different mechanism, oxidative stress, that's the Radicava. And then if you can click one more time, you can see that the third drug that was approved, Relivio, targets both mitochondrial dysfunction and ER stress. And that's because actually the drug itself, Relivio, is a combination of 2 drugs, each doing something different. So again, you can see here that the trials also allowed, again, add-on treatment strategies, meaning that participants in the trials were allowed to take the previous drugs, the previously approved drugs. So here we're thinking about the combination of drugs that hopefully will work together to address ALS. You can click one more time. I also do want to acknowledge that now we are fortunately also looking at targeted treatments for people with genetically inherited ALS. And in particular, the first success in this area obviously is tofersen, which targets the trigger of the disease in people that carry the SOD1 gene mutation. Next slide. So I just want to share my views of where the field is going. So first of all, in the short term, I think we really have a shot at slowing down and potentially even stopping ALS, which for now will likely require a cocktail of products, again, because they address different parts of the cell or different mechanisms. Obviously, if somebody has a genetic component to their disease, targeted drugs like tofersen would be applicable and certainly welcome. Next slide, next point. Ultimately, because now we have these targeted drugs that could potentially even prevent ALS in genetic carriers, pre-symptomatic carriers, we certainly want to leverage that. And I'm really happy that we're seeing movement in this direction, specifically with the ATLAS trial that's aiming at preventing ALS, hopefully, in the people who are genetic carriers or the SOD1 mutation. Next slide. Ultimately, we want to reverse ALS. And while that's obviously a more long-term goal, I hope that with these combinations of products and different drugs acting together, we'll be able, hopefully, to achieve this goal. Next slide. And the last thing I want to mention here is that the good news is, and the reason I am optimistic that these goals can actually be achieved, is that we are seeing over 200 companies in the ALS space with active clinical trial networks and engaged patient population, as well as engaged and collaborative foundations. So really, we have the entire community trying to work together to develop new treatments. And again, that's something that has developed over time, and certainly it has accelerated recently. That's why I think we're seeing more approvals recently, and most importantly, we're seeing a lot more drugs in development. Next slide. This is just a snapshot to show the ALS clinical trials in the phase 2 to 3 space that have been actively enrolling in the US. Obviously, there's more trials globally. But the reason I wanted to show this is because we're looking at the last 25 years or so, and you can see the acceleration. Again, as a testament to what I said earlier, like, now we have much more research, which we didn't have before. As of today, we have, over the last 3 years, really, we have seen 26 trials in the US, of which the platform trial is a large component. And really, this was not the case. Just even a few years ago, just even before the pandemic, there were only a handful of trials. And now we're really seeing a tremendous acceleration. And by having so many more shots on goal, so many opportunities for success, hopefully we'll be able to really make progress faster and continue to develop new drugs. And again, I'm really hoping that we're going to see a number of approvals over the next few years. Next slide. And here again, I want to summarize, and I'm sorry if I'm going too long, but I thought it was important for me to really summarize the current and evolving landscape of ALS clinical trials, because we get this question often. And so I really wanted to provide an opportunity to discuss all these points. I also want to mention that many of the concepts I'm presenting today, and I will be presenting over the last 2 weeks, I presented recently at the biggest neurology conference that's available, which is the American Academy of Neurology Conference. And so I really wanted to bring the same content to the public. The meeting was mostly for researchers and investigators and physicians, but I really wanted really to share all of this with you. If you can click one more time, again, I think that what we're seeing is that we have many trials, and most importantly, more efficient trials. In fact, we need trials to be efficient, to prioritize and rapidly move drugs forward, only those that are more likely to succeed. So we want a robust and efficient phase 2 pipeline to be able to move drugs to phase 3. And that's exactly what the platform trial is trying to do. Next slide, or next point. I also want to mention that as we're doing this, as we are building more efficient trials that are also learning opportunities, we want to use biomarkers. We want to develop new biomarkers. We want to discover and validate them, because we really want to be able to learn from the trials and identify those individuals that are more likely to respond to one agent versus another. And so this makes the trials more efficient and more successful. And so we continue to do that. That's why we have a whole biomarker pipeline built into the platform trial. And it's really to learn more about ALS and to be able to identify responders more easily. Click one more time. I think as we do this, we want to be thoughtful in terms of how can we continue to build research capacity. And so I really want to personally thank all of you who are contributing to ALS research, because really, in order to do all of this work and run all of these trials that, that's so many more compared to just 5 years ago, we really need to continue all the fundraising activities and all the funding needs to be able to come to the clinics and to the centers, so that we can continue to increase our research capacity, which basically means hiring more people, hiring more nurses, hiring more research coordinators, so that we can move forward quickly with all these trials. Click one more time. Also, access and inclusion is very important, and that's why we are trying to include as many sites as possible for the platform trial. We are now operating on a network of over 70 sites because we really want trials to be available not just in the big cities or in big academic centers, but also in private practices in different states, not just along the coasts, but also in the Midwest, in the South, in other areas. And we're so proud that we're partnering with so many clinics and hospitals. And for the first time, we'll be able to bring trials to some areas. And so we're very, very excited about all of this. Next slide, next point. So I want to mention that there are very robust academic networks, both in the US and internationally. And in the US specifically, the largest network, which is also the largest in the world, is the NEALS Consortium. NEALS stands for Northeast ALS Consortium because it was founded by Dr. Sukovich and other colleagues in the Northeast in the 90s. However, it has grown nationally and internationally, and now we have sites all over the country. So that's why it kind of keeps the original name, but really it's a national and even global network. And that's very important, and so that all of our investigators are on the same page and aware of trials as they become available. Next point. So the next point is that we really need to work and advocate in terms of regulations. So the interesting thing, and something that I honestly learned over the last few years, I wasn't really aware of that until I started doing this work more closely, is that different regions, meaning different countries, have different regulations when it comes to drug approval. And those differences can actually be quite pronounced. So that's why some drugs are only available in some regions and not others. And each region is different. So the US has the FDA, Canada has Health Canada as the regulatory agency, the European Union has the European Medicines Agency, the UK is now outside the EU, so they have their own agency, Japan as a different agency. So again, this is very complicated. Hopefully there will be opportunities to harmonize all of this, but as of right now, that's why some drugs get approved in some countries before others, because the rules or the process can be quite different. Next point. I do want to mention that something that we're all working on collaboratively in the academic community and with many patient groups and foundations and other stakeholders is that we really need to find ways to give better access to approved drugs patients, because clearly this has been a learning experience, and we have seen that with recently approved drugs, and I'm sure we'll continue to see it, but we need to do better because these drugs should get to all people, without all the difficulties that we've been seeing. Next point. The last point I wanted to make on this slide is that we are entering a new era in ALS. When I started, after residency, there was only one drug available, Riluzole. And that means that there was no head-to-head comparison or clinically effectiveness studies, meaning there was no need to compare the drug to anything else or to see what effect it would have sort of in the real world. But now that we have so many more drugs, there's really a need to understand what's the best cocktail for one person versus another. We're not quite there yet, but I think that so far the drugs that have been developed have all been developed sort of on top of each other, meaning allowing standard of care, which is the right thing to do, so that we can show sort of additive effects compared to what was previously available. However, hopefully we'll have many more drugs. And so, right now we know that the three drugs, Riluzole, Radicava, and Relivro, can be safely combined. But obviously, if we were to find ourselves in the situation of, let's say, 10 drugs over the next few years, then we would have to figure out, to learn more about the drug-drug interactions and how to safely combine them. Next slide. And again, I want to leave you with the idea that the HEALEY ALS Platform Trial is trying to tackle all of the concepts that I shared so far. That's why we got together with so many partners, both in academia, industry, and the patient community. So thank you so much to everyone who is supporting the trial. We're certainly not the only ones who are trying to solve all these difficult problems, but certainly we want to also contribute. And again, everything that we're doing to develop the trial, to adapt it, to really include more drugs, and the way it's designed and continues to adapt is really to try to address all these challenges, which are also opportunities. And so hopefully by testing even more drugs in the near future, we'll be able to make some progress. Next slide. And so if you can click quickly through these, because I know I went too long for today, but I really wanted to share all of these with you. I just wanted to share that, actually, thank you. So we share again, since 2020, we have been adding a total of 7 drugs or 7 regimens to our common infrastructure. And so we're talking of over 1,000 participants who have been enrolled so far. And really with the central governance and infrastructure, we're really trying to make progress faster. And if you can go to the next slide now, I want to show you kind of going back to the idea of the multiple mechanisms that are involved in ALS. I want to show you how we're still really casting a broad net to try to tackle ALS from different angles. So if you can click one more time, you wanted to share that the first drug that unfortunately didn't work, the Leucoplan, the first drug that was included in the platform, was targeting the complement system. And while it's disappointing to know that that particular drug didn't work, this was an important lesson for the field, because now we know that going on after the complement is probably not a good idea. Maybe the complement is involved in ALS, but it's not the primary driver. So we should not be targeting that specifically. And we learned that thanks to the platform trial and 2 other independent programs that also had negative results. And again, it's disappointing to see negative results, but it's also impossible. It's also very important to kind of check off mechanisms that are unlikely to work. And so we did that with regimen A. Next click is the second regimen, which also didn't work and allowed us to rule out that the drug, the Diperstat, working on myeloperoxidase, another component of neuroinflammation, really ruled out its effectiveness. And so again, while it's important, while it's disappointing to have another negative result, it was important to also rule out the drug quickly. You can click the next 2, regimen C and then regimen D. They have 2 different mechanisms. They target mechanisms that had not been targeted before. And what's interesting is that there were some promising signals from these regimens. They didn't have wildly positive results. In fact, the primary endpoint was negative. However, there were a number of signals in each regimen suggesting that we need to move these drugs to a separate phase 3 trial to fully learn about their effects. And so that was kind of, the other interesting result that we got from regimen C and D. Next click shows trialos, or the 5th regimen in the platform trial, targeting a different mechanism, autophagy. And we don't know yet the result of this regimen. We will know by the end of the year. So thank you so much to all of you who are participating in this regimen, and hopefully we'll have the results in just a few months. Next, if you can click the next one, here I wanted to end with the current regimens F and G. They both target a different mechanism called integrated stress response. So they both target the same mechanism with different compounds. We know that this is a promising mechanism. We're very excited to really work on it. This is something that's been really emerging in the literature recently as an important key point in the development of ALS. And it's really not been fully studied before. So I think we're going to get very important insights about these drugs and about the role of the integrated stress response, which I think is going to be really milestone as we, again, continue to learn more about ALS and try to find better ways to target the disease. Next slide. And on that note, I want to leave you with our information about Catherine and Alison are really wonderful and available as a central resource for people living with ALS. You can find them at the phone number and email on the slide. Please register for our webinars and our ALS link, which is a newsletter, if you would like webinar information and other research information to come directly to your inbox. And next week, again, I'll give a summary, a more in-depth summary of what we're seeing from the platform trial so far. And with that, I think that was the last slide. I think we can stop sharing and maybe we can take a few questions. I'm sorry I went a little over time, but I really wanted to share this content with you because I presented that to my colleagues. I really wanted to present it to everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Paganoni. That was amazing. So much information. And we do have just a couple of questions I wanted to get to before we let everybody go. There is a question about the Tralos EAP program. Can you explain to people what that is and how they might be able to get information about participating?
Absolutely. So trehalose is the name of a drug that's being tested now in regimen E of the platform trial. We will get the results by the end of the year. There is a parallel but separate program called the trehalose EAP, or trehalose Expanded Access Protocol, that's available for people who are not eligible for clinical trials. And so to get information about the sites and how to participate, I would suggest that you start talking to your physician, because we have 25 sites. Not all of them are ready to enroll participants, but there's 25 sites that will be ready to enroll participants. Some of them are already active. And so if you ask your physician if they're part of the program or not, they'll be able to tell you. But if you're not at one of those 25 sites, there are opportunities to leverage other sites in your geographic area. Please contact the patient navigator, Catherine, to get information about that as well.
Excellent. And there's a compliment. Thank you for showing the correlations between the mechanisms and the drugs. That's very helpful. Can you explain, Dr. Paganoni, why there are 240 participants for regimens F and G when there was 160 for A, B, C, D, and E?
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, actually, as we have more drugs approved and people take approved drugs or approved standard of care, when we test a new drug on top of that, we actually need to increase the sample size to account for the changes in natural history that the other drugs provide. So now, essentially, we're testing each new drug, let's say F and G, on top of not just riluzole, but of combinations of riluzole, Radicava, and Relivio. And so to do that, we need a bigger trial.
Dr. Paganoni, one further question came in about the, it's a tofersen EAP, sorry. Do you see any gaps in availability in going from EAP to insurance in that process, how that works?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll be honest with you, I think that, hopefully that's not gonna happen in any way. I agree with you, there should be no interruption. I know that many people are working very hard on these exact problem or concern. And so I would suggest that you talk with your site. Hopefully, again, there will not be any delays. But I know that, that's obviously something that's very much front and center for everyone who works in an ALS clinic. I think that Niels has had some webinar, or will have some webinars. So there are resources available, and obviously, as we learn more, different colleagues who are more closely involved with this program will bring updates by way of public webinars.
Thank you. And can you explain why patients with epilepsy are removed from regimen G?
So, each regimen has very few specific additional exclusionary criteria depending on the characteristics of the specific drug. So it could be a drug-drug interaction or some safety concerns. And so again, it really depends on the development of each drug. And so there was a specific request for every regimen has had that, which is very common in drug development.
I know we're over time, but we have just a couple more questions. Thank you for your patience. Also, regarding eligibility, what is the FVC cutoff for the platform trial, and why is that important?
Yes, it's 50%, 50, which is much lower than the majority of other trials.
And last question, why do you think integrated stress is so important?
So we're still learning about all of the different mechanisms that cause ALS, and the integrated stress response seems to be central to some of the mechanisms that are actually being affected by TDP-43, which is a protein that can get accumulated and essentially trigger a number of downstream events that can be toxic to neurons. And so it's really like a core mechanism that is on the pathway of TDP-43 and its accumulation. So I really think that the science is exciting for both of these compounds.
Wonderful. Last question, I promise. Is drug interaction data available for DNL343?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Is drug interaction available? Well, I mean, for specific regimens, yes. Every time, every company ever every single company does drug-drug interaction, analysis and studies, and those are even before we can give the drug to patients in a trial. And so some of these are we learn from animal studies, other in vitro toxicology, dedicated toxicology studies. Others are lessons learned from previous smaller trials, and so each drug has a set of drug-drug interactions depending on the metabolism of the drug. So yes, when somebody goes for screening for a specific regimen, the site team will look specifically at the drugs that that person is receiving for other reasons. And if there is any interaction, oftentimes one can change the drug, because there are many times you can have, let's say, different antibiotics, for example, or a different drug that does the same thing and doesn't have the interaction. Unfortunately, sometimes people may be excluded if there is an interaction there that cannot be resolved. However, I have to say that's actually the beauty of the platform trial, where essentially if somebody screen fails or is not able to be included, for example, because of the drug-drug interaction in one regimen, hopefully they can be reassigned immediately to the other available regimens. And again, because these interactions are so specific to each drug, chances are that if somebody is not eligible due to a drug-drug interaction for one regimen, hopefully they'll be eligible for another regimen.
Wonderful. Hey, Dr. Paganoni, thank you so much for your time. I'll turn over to you for any last words.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you for all the great questions. And I just see a question also about Tregs, and so I just wanted to mention that right now we don't have a drug that specifically targets Tregs in the platform trial, but that might be possible in the future. So again, there's other programs that are also targeting Tregs. Great. So thank you so much, Alison and Catherine and everyone, and we'll be back again for another summary of what we have learned so far from the platform trial next week. Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.